Old Sword Club weekly live stream. I'm your host. I feel like I go into like air pilot mode a lot of the time with this. But anyway, hey, I'm Tim. I'm the instructor type person here at the Old Sword Club. So I teach physical lessons when we have physical lessons to teach, and now I'm doing cool stuff, sword stuff online because it's lockdown and COVID, and it's the safest way to actually do sword lessons. So this week we're going to be talking about remisses or remisses, reprises, and redoubles. Basically ways of launching multiple attacks on the same lunge, or like without fully having reset to a guard. I think I posted in the Facebook event for this some of the sources I've used for the workshop, and one of the things about them was that they didn't always have the same definition for what a remiss and a reprise or a redouble were. So obviously I'll do my best to say whose definition I'm using and whose ideas I'm using, but sometimes I kind of end up averaging out different ideas to try and get a sense of what was felt in the period. But that the perils of any kind of historical work is attitudes at a given time are not uniform. I think the idea that there is a perfect uniform fencing from any given period is a bit misleading at best. All right, so anyway, let's get started. So just derobe. I'm just taking my jacket off. This is not that kind of that kind of web episode. Don't get too excited. All right, cool. And so I'll grab my trusty sword. And if you're following along at home, grab your own. But let's start out. I did want to quickly go over the basics of 19th century British sabre, just so that we're all on the same page. As much as these are quite advanced skills, these are skills that beginners and even quite experienced fencers don't necessarily use very often, or can use at all. It's my understanding quite a few of the people who are interested are people who do other sabre systems, who do continental, like French or Italian sabre. So it's probably worth kind of all getting on the same page about what techniques I'm using. Anyway, to start off with, we're going to form the medium guard. So I just start in this position, which is slope sword, feet together, standing upright, sword on the shoulder. I take my offside, so sword side, offside. Take my offside foot and bring it round behind my sword side foot, so my feet are in nil. And then I step till my feet are about 2 foot widths apart, give or take. From here, I sink down, so I've got a nice relaxed bend in my legs. How do I know I've got enough bend? Well, a really, really easy test is just step back and forward, and if your head doesn't bob up and down too much, you're bent enough that you either don't have any extraneous movement, or you're not walking like one of those weird drinky birds that bob up and down. And now I'm going to form the medium guard. So to start with, I'm going to take my offhand. I'm just going to sit it on my hip, bent at 90 degrees, and then with my sword side arm, I bend it at 90 degrees and hang so that my forearm is about horizontal and sitting right in the middle. So if I extend my arm out straight forward, and then bring it back, it's now right in the middle, or like right on the center line. Sorry, I just want to check a comment. Been a bit paranoid about my sound. But this is a medium guard. It's a guard in the middle. It's not an outside guard. It's not an inside guard. It's a medium guard. And the other thing I want my tip to be roughly the same height as my shoulder. So if I move back, so you can use the vertical blinds or horizontal blinds as measure. My sword is rough. The tip of my sword is roughly the same height as my shoulder. Alfred Hutton, who's sort of the primary manual I use for particularly this guard, he says that your sword should be in a direct straight line facing, or your blade should be facing your opponent's face in a direct straight line. So if they look down at your hand, their blade, your tip should be pointing right at them. I find as kind of a better metric is I want my tip low enough that if I extend out straight, stab my opponent in the face. So it's like too high like this, can't stab my opponent in the face, I want it low. But I also want it high enough that if I want to chop my opponent on the arm, I can extend out and just give a quick chop. So I don't want it flat like this, because as much as I can now thrust, I can't chop without having to raise my tip first. So this is the medium guard, which is the guard we'll be working from tonight. If you're following my exact movements, some of you might decide you want to use techniques from systems that you practice rather than the ones I do, and that's perfectly cool. I'd actually be really interested to see, or like to hear how you adapt it. Cool. So now let's look at the basic cuts. So come on guard, I start doing the moulinet. So moulinet is just a wrist mobility exercise where I go through each of the cut angles, and to start I extend my arm out, my sword faces out this way, I drop it down, and that's cut number 1. I bring it around to this angle and drop it for cut number 2, turn over, whip it back up for cut number 3, bring it round and straight back up for cut number 4, bring it over and flat for cut number 5, turn over and come back for cut number 6, and bring it all the way vertical and drop down for cut number 7, and back to guard. So let's do that just in order, or just as a smooth, continuous movement. So extend and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and back to guard. And now extend 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and back to guard. Extend and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and back to guard. I'm going to quickly check comments just to make sure everything's okay. Cool, yeah, all good. All right, so now let's make things a little bit more complicated. Now I want you to return to guard between each cut. So extend out, cut 1, back to guard. Extend out, cut 2, back to guard. Extend out. With cut 3, if you're having trouble getting to this angle, try lifting up your shoulder or bending your elbow. So show it from the side. Lift your shoulder, bend your elbow, or both. Kind of hunch up, and that will give you, that'll let your hand get your hand around enough. Although if you do enough moulinets, eventually you'll have the mobility to just go to this position. Okay? Whip up and back to guard. Extend for cut 4, up, back to guard. Extend for cut 5, cross, back to guard. Extend for cut 6, across, back to guard. And extend for cut 7, down and back to guard. So let's just do that by numbers, just to make life, just to make get some extra practice in. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. All right, and one thing you'll notice, with the exception of cut number 7, which is purely vertical and straight down the center line, when I do a cut, my hand and my tip start on opposite sides of my body. So when I go for, say, a cut number 1, my tip is on my sword side, but my hand is on my off side. And that's really, really important, because it's really important that I keep my sword in front of me as I attack. So I do this. It doesn't seem like much of a movement, but you notice how you can see directly straight down the middle. Like you can, if you were in front of me and you sent your sword and you slash straight forward or thrust straight forward, there'd be nothing in your way. Whereas here, now there's a sword in your way. So I actually want to keep my sword in front of me to cover me as I throw my cut. So let's go again, and I want you to focus on keeping the sword in front of you as you do the cuts this time. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. And 7 is cutting straight down the center line. So you're pretty much going to clear anything that's following those rules or take someone's hand off as they come in. One of the two. So, yeah, that's good. Cool. So I'll just quickly check for comments. If you have any questions, just chuck them in the chat. Someone said, well, Desmond's actually said something relevant to medium guard, which is there was a difference between medium guards in Roworth and Angela, if I remember correctly. I believe there is. I'm not a Roworth or an Angela expert. Generally, you do see variants. Like you do see a medium guard like this, where it's extended straight vertically. You don't see it extended flat very often in this kind of long point position, unless it's retracted. But yeah, I think generally what you don't see a lot of in the 19th century is this, where the sword is held vertically in a retracted guard. Someone's going to hold the sword vertically, it's an extended guard, or they'll bring it down flatter if it's in a retracted guard. And the reason for that is, from here, I don't need to worry about, like, from here, I'm going to need to move back or prime to attack, which is very telegraphic, whereas from here, I can bring my tip straight down. From here, I can extend straight out and just hit, so I don't need to worry about, so I don't need to worry about priming because my elbow is bent, and I can generate power that way. The reason you don't see this until much later, and I think a lot of that is, there are reasons why you would do this, but the downside, and as someone who's mostly looked at why you wouldn't do this, the downside is your opponent can smother your blade and intersect it anywhere along here. Like, they can hit you anywhere along the blade and basically, smother your blade as they come in for an attack. Whereas from here, if they want to cover themselves, they've only really got between sort of the height of my hand and my shoulder, which means that the attack is coming in at a much, much more limited space. All right, speaking of attacks, let's look at footwork. So with remisses, reprises, and redoubles, a lot of it actually comes down to footwork. Let's start with reprises. But we're going to need to start by looking at basic lunging to really understand sort of where, how to then do the more advanced forms of footwork. So to lunge, we extend. I'm just extending in this cut number 1. Kick my foot out. I drive forward, rolling from my heel to my toes, and when my toes hit the ground, is the point where I hit my opponent. I let my hand drift down a little bit, so I cut through my opponent or cut through my target, and then I retract by pulling with my back leg, pushing off, lifting my toes with my front leg, and extending my and bringing my blade fully extended. So if my opponent comes rushing in at me, they're going to run onto my blade rather than rushing me. I come back, and then I return to guard. I don't want to return to guard before I fully retracted, because then I'm leaving myself open to having someone come at me quite aggressively. I want to leave my tip out to deter or to make it harder for my opponent to come in at me. So let's practice it again. So extend, kick, lunge, retract. Extend, kick, lunge, retract. Extend, kick, lunge, retract. Extend, kick, lunge, retract. If you've done Olympic fencing or even other contemporary 19th century styles of fencing, you might notice that this lunge seems quite short. I'm only going to about really 4 foot widths. I think it's the 1845 Angelo, so the 3rd Angelo manual, says that a lunge is only like 4 foot widths and a guard is 2. And even the lunge I'm doing now is probably a bit longer than what is generally recommended in manuals. But within these systems, within 19th century fencing, you tend to have quite short lunges compared to sort of modern fencing where you lunge so much so that you need to roll your foot to stop it, to not hurt your ankle, and be really extended. And most modern Olympic fencers have a much longer lunge than this. I just don't, I don't lunge like that, so I don't have that. I'm not very good at it. Why the lunge is so short? Well, it can be, for one, because the weapon is a lot heavier, and also edge alignment means that attacks are more limited in their angle and a bit slower, so you can actually get closer and still safely defend yourself. The other thing is also when you're on uneven ground, so something I discovered and unfortunately in the middle of a public display, on wet grass, you can't have a very long lunge because you will be a lot more unstable. And also when you don't have modern grippy shoes, it's a bit harder to be stable, so you tend to have shorter lunges. This isn't to say that really long lunges didn't exist historically, they most certainly did, but in these systems, which were not necessarily battlefield, but even just recreational, like if you're just meeting in a public park or out the back of someone's place or whatever, where you couldn't be assured of the surface you're fencing on, you might favour a more stable lunge over a longer, more explosive one. All right, so let's practice that all together. So I'm just going to call lunge, and I just want you to lunge with cuts 1 and 2. So lunge, 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 and lunge, and back to guard. All right, so let's start out by looking at remisses or remisses. I've only ever read the word, or I'd only ever read the word up until I was preparing for this workshop and decided to see if anyone else had done any work on it, and realized that I may or may not have been pronouncing the word wrong the entire time. But a remiss is where you make 2 cuts or 2 attacks on the same lunge. So what I do is I lunge, I come to full extension, and I throw another attack with minimal retraction. In my case, I'm just pulling my shoulder and arm back. I'm not even bending my arm that bit. I'm mostly just trying to get my tip back so I can whip it forward again, do it as quickly as possible. But, I'm not retracting very much, if at all. Traditionally, these are meant to be bad fencing. So Alfred Hutton says basically don't ever do them. They're bad fencing, you shouldn't do them. John Musgrave Wade is a bit more nuanced about it. He says like they're dangerous. He says they're dangerous, but here's how to do a remiss. He doesn't give full technical advice, but he gives a little bit of advice about how and when to do it. Most instructors in the period say not to. The reason being is you're very, very likely to get hit yourself. It's more likely to end in a double hit, where both you and your opponent are struck, as opposed to you landing a clean hit. And also in the period, in 19th century, most fencing rules, so most rules for bouting, when they're determining who won an exchange, the rules worked against people who were missed. So if there was a double, if you lunged and if you lunged, your opponent lashed out, it would hit you. If you're on the lunge, you got the point. If, however, you hadn't come back, you hadn't fully guard, then your opponent got the point. And so and this is something Wade actually says is remisses are not great because the rules are stacked against them. But you can do them. Generally when you do them, if you're going to do it successfully, it's when either you're very, very confident you know where your opponent's going to riposte, so your second cut is essentially a counter cut. You're actually able to smother their blades so they can't hit you whilst you hit them, which means you have to very, very reliably know where they're going to come. So if you've got an opponent who is consistently throwing the same riposte, if you come in, they parry, riposte with a 7, parry, riposte with 7, what have you, you can be like, okay, I know they're going to do a 7, so what I can do is I can intercept that and I can angle my cut so that I choke up their cut and hit them, the same way that when you're attacking, you prevent a counter cut, or you prevent yourself from being counter thrust. The other time you do them, this is when your opponent is parrying but not riposting. So particularly if you've got a very nervous opponent who might just kind of parry and then not do anything, then you can remiss because they've not done anything. And the third time is when you've got an opponent who's got a shit parry. So if your opponent parries too wide, you know, when their parry is like, you can see how there's a big gap between my sword and my body. I'm parrying too wide. When I parry, my sword should be just next to my body. If I come directly in front of the camera's at a bit of a weird angle. You know, you can see my hand is basically in line with my body, and same on this side. Whereas if you've got someone who's parrying quite wide, also if you've got someone who's parrying really vertically, if people are parrying basically with a vertical sword like this, you can throw a second attack and usually get control of the blade or take advantage of a weak parry. And with remisses, that's often what you do is if your opponent has a parry, you know, has poor technique when parrying, but it's enough to stop the initial attack, you can throw a second one to basically exploit the weakness of the parry. So the way you remiss, let's get into the technique of it. It's fairly simple. I lunge, I come to my full extension, in this case I'm using cut number 1, and then so that I can stay extended and still get power in my cut, I pull my shoulder back, so you can see my shoulder moving. I'll show you that from the other side actually. You can see how I'm moving my shoulder. If anyone's any done boxing, you've heard about like the shoulder whirl to generate power when you punch. Similar mechanics to that. I'm bending my arm, not that much, that amount. But it's getting my sword back. And the other thing is I'm lifting my tip up so that I'm coming around my opponent's sword. So I want to come in the other side. So otherwise there's no chance I'm going to smother attack. And then I come back. I personally recommend if you're going to do this, you want a very, very vertical cut. So a number 7 with maybe a bit of angle, but not much. You don't want to be coming all the way around because then you won't be able to get your control of your opponent's blade. The other bit of advice actually, if you're going to remiss, which again is generally considered bad fencing and highly risky, if you're going to do it, your second attack needs to come, or basically needs to cross your opponent's. And one of the best ways to actually achieve that is for you to come down parallel to their blade. So if my opponent is parrying like this, you know, I want my blade to come basically like that, so that when my opponent turns to come, they're going to cross and intersect. And I want it to be fairly close. I want to keep my sword close to theirs, so that there's every chance that I will choke them up. So when I remiss, so from my cut 1, pull back, cut 2. You can have a bit of body movement. I instinctively tend to, but it's not necessary. Back and in, and then back to guard. So to show you that from the front, so extend, back, remiss, and back to guard. Right, so let's practice that with a 1-7 a few times, just so you can get some practice in. So, medium guard, cut 1, remiss to 7, back to guard. 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 Cut 1, remiss to 7, and back to guard. So obviously you can do this on the other side as well. So I can throw a cut number 2 and then remiss to 7. Theoretically, you can do it with any 2 cuts. In some cases, it's even suggested you could do it with 2 of the same cut. So what you would do is you would throw cut 1 and then throw another cut 1. If you've got an opponent who's trying to defend purely by distance, like you're slipping and then coming back in a very sloppy way, that could work. But yeah, otherwise, I find the most common, you generally doing this with descending cuts just because those are the most common cuts. So let's look at the same mechanic, but with cut 2. So if I come to the medium guard, I extend to cut 2, pull back, cut 7, and back to guard. Cut 2, pull back to 7, and back to guard. And one thing you'll notice is when I'm going to cut 2, I'm stopping at extension. And this is to simulate my opponent having parried me. If I was just throwing a cut 2, I'd come all the way down to there, but that's not the position I'm going to be in if I'm remissing. I'm going to be here because I've been parried and have to come around my opponent's blade. So, cut 2, remiss to 7, and back to guard. Cut 2, remiss to 7, and back to guard. And from here, cut 2, remiss to 7, back to guard. Cut 2, remiss to 7, and back to guard. All right, so that's how you do a remiss in 19th century British sabre. The same thing gets done in lots of other systems with different techniques. I actually find with people who do medieval and Renaissance system, a lot of them remiss all the time. That's obviously not the terms that they would view it in because they're using different fencing vocabulary and different theory. But for me, to my 19th century eyes, I'm like, why are you remissing all the time? You know, why are you doing something that would be bad fencing? The problem with that, of course, for me, is I fence people who remiss like the Dickens and just got repeatedly stabbed in the face because I've had opponents like do something that I've not trained to deal with. I've trained to deal with people who parry, riposte, like, you know, will always make sure that they've got clear initiative after a parry or because they're initiating the exchange, and have been told that remissing is not a good thing to do. But when someone does it to you, it's often quite, you know, it's quite difficult to do it. And I've never had someone successfully remiss me without being hit themselves, but that's not really, that's very, very little consolation when you get stabbed in the face. You know, when you get stabbed in the face, no amount of telling the other person how bad their fencing form is actually makes you any less stabbed in the face. So we need to also think about how to deal with it when an opponent does. So I'm just going to quickly comment. So Mick wants to know, after the first cut, are you rocking your weight back or keeping it on the front foot? Short answer is you're keeping it on the front foot. I mean, I pull back mostly because I was getting a bit lazy. But with a remiss, it's mostly shoulder and arm and like turning the torso. When you're switching weight, that would then technically be a redouble, so it's technically something else. When you're actually fencing, whether it's a remiss or a double matters less than if it works. But in terms of having a vocabulary to describe what we're doing, a remiss is where you're fully extended and you retract using just your arm and twist your shoulder, but you don't transfer weight. A redouble is where you transfer weight, but don't move your feet. That's how I'm defining it. All right. So, how do we deal with a remiss? A mix just made the comment, so speed is the key. Which short answer is a bit. I actually find with remissing, when you can get it to work, the actual key is predictability. If you know what your opponent is going to do, there was, I think it was the Swordfish Sabre finals from a few years ago. There was a guy who was the first person I ever seen to pull off remisses successfully. I looked at this about like 2-3 days ago and I've forgotten which tournament it was, but the point was what he would do is he'd do like 2-3 exchanges, and then after the second, and then if his opponent responded reliably the same way, he'd remiss and countercut them and deal with their response. So speed is very, very important to get a remiss to work. But the other thing that's really, really important is predicting what your opponent's going to do. Anyway, let's look at how you deal with remisses. So let's say you've got an opponent. They come at you with a cut, and you've parried their cut, and then they come at you with another cut or some other action. What you need to do is riposte on the slip. So what I do is either pull my feet together to come to first position, or I pull my knees together to pull back like this. I actually, for this, I much prefer the knees together. So if I need to keep going, I can. Or the other thing you can do is just do a proper retreat where I just step back. But what I do is I parry, and then I riposte whilst retreating. What I'm trying to do is riposte to the arm. So I'm taking advantage of the fact that my opponent is staying extended. You'll notice when I do a remiss, my arm is fairly extended the entire time. I'm never pulling it all the way back, because if I pull it all the way back, my opponent's going to have a chance to hit me. But that does mean my arm is also extended. So if my opponent parries and then steps back and countercuts, I'm going to get hit in the arm. I personally recommend riposting with a rising cut, usually cut number 4. So riposting like that. The reason being is from here, I can pull back into a head guard or a high prime really, just in case my opponent keeps coming, which might happen in a real fight. You might not injure the arm enough to disable it. Based on historical accounts, I actually think that's quite unlikely. But, it's always better to be safe. But the bigger thing is, particularly in like a tournament situation, if you counter hit someone, they might instinctively lash out at you to try and turn a clean hit into a double, or an afterblow, so that they don't lose the exchange, or they don't lose points, or prevent you from gaining points, whatever the scoring system is. So yeah, you want to be able to retract to some kind of parry very easily. So the method of defending is parry and slip and riposte, and potentially guard. So let's practice this with the guard, because I think it's a good habit to get into, just to instinctively protect yourself, just even if you don't have to. So let's start, assuming our opponent comes at us with a cut number 1. So I don't hit my own couch. I have no idea what to do if someone remisses with you while you're standing in front of a couch. I'm sorry. Please don't ask me that in the questions. Don't at me. All right, so parry, riposte. Straight from the side, parry, riposte. Parry, riposte. Parry, riposte. Crash into your couch. There we go. You just move sideways. Parry, riposte, and guard. Parry, riposte, and guard. Parry, riposte, and guard. And once more for luck. Parry, riposte, and guard. All right. Now, if your opponent is attacking to your outside, parry. So I parry to tierce. Riposte with number 3. Or you can riposte with a number 4. I find either works. Although I'm going to do cut number 3 just because I need to practice them and they don't get enough love. So my parry, just from the front, is parry of tierce, and 3 retreat, and then here to high up carve. I'm pulling back to this guard. My opponent keeps coming forward and is hopefully deflected off. I can even get another attack in at them. So from here, parry, riposte, and guard. parry, riposte and slip, and guard. Parry, riposte and slip, and guard. And once more for each side. Parry, riposte and retreat, and guard. Parry, riposte and retreat, and guard. Parry, riposte and retreat, and guard. Alright, so yeah, it's all well and good to know the technique though, but when you're actually practicing this, and something that I recommend you do if you have partners to practice with now, or you're watching this in the future when after the plague, is actually do judgment drills where you have someone attack you. If they will either recover, so they will move back, and they'll move back either to a guard or through a parry, in which case you have to riposte them on the lunge, or they will remiss, at which point you have to slip and riposte. And they will do it randomly. So the idea is that you learn to judge what your opponent is doing. And then you can make that even more complicated again, where you are throwing random, you're exchanging parry and riposte. So each person takes a turn to parrying and riposte. So one person might throw a cut 4, the other person parries it with second and riposte with 7. The first person has to defend the head guard and throw again. So just what I call the slow riposte drill. But every so often, one designated partner will remiss. So they'll throw their riposte and then they'll remiss, and the other partner has to react to that remiss. I recommend doing it slowly at first so people have a bit of time to build judgment. But the key to dealing with remisses, more so than knowing to slip on the riposte, as counterintuitive as that is already, is actually having the judgment to defend it. Because as much as under 19th century fencing rules, if someone remisses you, if you parry and riposte and someone remisses you, you're still going to get the point. You're going to win the point. If we're looking at actual useful deployable sword fighting, someone remissing you and hitting you still means you get hit and injured, and your riposte isn't necessarily going to stop them. And I do find a few times, actually a lot of times when people remiss me, it's more of like their blow does come in after I've riposted them, just because riposting after a parry delivers a quicker cut than remissing often does. But I'm still getting hit, so it's better to have solutions and excuses. All right, so just quickly check comments, quickly take a sip of tea. And now let's look at redoubles. So a redouble is where you renew the attack without having completely returned to guard. So if I'm on guard, I will throw my attack, start returning, and renew my attack. And to go back to Mick's comments from before, the difference between a remiss and a redouble is with a remiss, I maybe turn my body, but I don't fully pull back. Whereas with a redouble, I pull back, but I generally don't fully move my feet. So I might lift my toes to retract. I am moving away, but I move very forward back again. And then the third stage is to have pulled my toes back, come back to guard, and then launch again, which is what Waite calls a reprise. Hutton doesn't call that a reprise at all. But yeah, I find within fencing, that's just another attack, because there's an expectation that you'll return to guard before throwing your next attack. In terms of when to use redoubles, basically under the same situations as a remiss. So when your opponent has a bad parry that will stop a direct attack but is not really great for anything else, and for when your opponent doesn't riposte. And this is what Jules Jacob recommends. He says, if your opponent isn't riposting you, you can throw a remiss. Oh, not a remiss, sorry. You should do a redouble, but that's the only situation you should redouble in. Visual Jacob also says you should never remiss, or basically, actually no, I think he outright says you should never remiss because it's too risky. I prefer redoubles to remisses because I think they're a bit safer. If I'm going to do something like that, or I want to renew my attack, I think that even if my opponent has a very predictable attack, has a very, very predictable riposte, it's still better to redouble than to remiss. But that's me and my preference. Your mileage might vary on that. So let's look at redoubles. So guard, cut one, extend, begin to pull back. I notice my opponent is not riposting, so I come back at them with another attack. My preferred redouble actually is a cut 7 to the arm. So if my opponent has parried, they parry, or even parry, there's just a bit of gap of arm that I can see. I can go in and hit the arm off the redouble, and this has the advantage because the arm is more extended than the torso or the head. I've got a better chance of hitting it. So let's look at how to do a redouble. So we're going to do cut 1, redouble to cut 7. And that is lunge to 1, pull back, cut 7. Back to guard. Lunge to 1, pull back, cut 7, back to guard. Lunge to 1, pull back, cut 7, and back to guard. Lunge to 1, pull back, cut 7, hit your phone, and back to guard. Thankfully, it's just the doorbell, so just means I won't get any deliveries through breaks. All right. Cut 1, pull back, cut 7, and back to guard. And once more for luck. Cut 1, pull back to 7, and back to guard. So obviously you can do redoubles with any combination of cuts. I find that cuts 1, 2, and 7 are the most common. So they're doing 1, 2, 2, 1, or 1, 7, or 2, 7. Theoretically, you could probably initiate with a 7, but I don't ever initiate with a 7, so I don't know how that would work. If you do, please let me know, because I just think that would be cool. All right, let's look at it the other way, which is cut 2, redouble to cut 7, and back to guard. Withdraw away from your phone, cut 2, redouble to cut 7, and back to guard. Cut 2, redouble to cut 7, and back to guard. Cut 2, redouble to cut 7, and back to guard. Cut 2, redouble to cut 7, and back to guard. I think that one got a bit abbreviated. The difference between a remiss and a redouble is sometimes a little grey, but that's how you throw redoubles. Personally, I find the times when they're most useful is when, well, one, you've got an opponent who doesn't riposte, or two, you've got an opponent who backs off, who slips on the riposte, or slips on their parry. So they'll do this, or even this, where they'll step back and parry, and then try and come back at you, because there's every chance that they'll stay, if you stay extended, if they've moved back too far away, they still won't hit you, and you've got a chance to get a very quick attack. You can renew your attack once they start coming forward, and get around the fact that they've run away. So Other than that, like I mean, I don't do a lot of redoubling. Probably the time I do it the most actually is against someone who backs off and just isn't prepared to engage or like isn't prepared to engage otherwise, because it means I can stay close to my opponent. Or someone who's again got a very, very predictable riposte, because it means that I can countercut them on the way out. And the reason I like the redouble is I can extend and countercut from further away. I'm actually moving back as I throw my countercut. And there's no reason why you can't keep recovering and just recover on a cut. In fact, something I used to do a lot once upon a time was when I needed to get out, I'd do a big number 7 straight down the middle as I was retracting to get my opponent to back off and to just knock out of the way anything that they were throwing at me to make them hesitant to come forward. In terms of how you deal with redoubles, having a quick para riposte is good. Having any riposte is good. And I know there's a lot of people who don't do para riposte fencing. If you come to the old Sword Club and Chris is there, Chris is not a big para riposte guy, but Chris will always riposte when we're after a parry, because it makes his opponent go away. You know, when I fence Chris, he will riposte because he knows that otherwise I will hang around. And even if you're looking to land a feint or a particularly explosive opening, or you're going to employ a beat or something like that, like you're not a para riposte fencer, you need to riposte just to keep your opponent from bearing in on you. So now let's look at reprises or reprises. If my pronunciation is wrong, let me know in the comments, because I've only ever read most of these words. I've not actually heard them spoken, and that's just a constant risk. All right, so a reprise, Wade defines it as just lunging straight away after retracting, which for me is just normal fencing. But Hutton, the way he defines it, is as a secondary action after you've got a secondary action on the same lunge after you've gotten control of your opponent's blade. So it's kind of a long string of actions, but what you do is you basically do something to control or to smother your opponent's blade. So my two favorites, the ones that I think work the best, is I'll throw with a cut 1. You can do this with a cut 2 as well, or it doesn't work quite as well. To be honest, I think it probably works better with a cut 2 than a cut 1. I'll throw, and then I'll basically do a prime parry. I'll come up to here, and then come straight back down. So for my cut 2, I'll prime parry and come straight back. And it's not, obviously I'm breaking it down into 3 distinct actions, but when I do it, it's very quick. In fact, prime parry riposte 7 in a continuous motion where I don't actually wait for contact is also something I like doing because it's very, very quick and deadly. But the idea is basically, this will work better from the front. I cut. I know my opponent's sword is going to have to come in somewhere high, and I know it's going to somewhere around here, unless they pull their sword back or they do something to recover. So if I've come in really deep, like we've really clashed, come straight back up to prime because my opponent's sword is going to be on top. I know my opponent's sword's going to be on top of mine. And I come straight down with a 7 or with another cut 2. And so that way I've gained control of my opponent's sword. And again, you can only do this if you know where your opponent's sword is going to be. If my opponent has a habit of parrying high, then yeah, I can get to here and be relatively safe. If my opponent brings the hand back, parries and comes back to center, this can be very dangerous because my opponent could come in underneath. I find, so let's practice that a few times. So let's do cut 2, and then basically a prime and a as a way of reprising. So cut 2, prime Moulinet reprise, and back to guard. Cut 2, prime Moulinet reprise, and back to guard. Cut 2, prime Moulinet reprise, and back to guard. Cut 2, prime Moulinet reprise, and back to guard. Cut 2, prime Moulinet reprise, and back to guard. Cut 2, prime Moulinet reprise, and back to guard. Cut 2, prime Moulinet reprise, and back to guard. 8. The other option is to go to a head guard. So as much as this head guard or St. George is not always the greatest parry, though I know there's quite a few people who just don't like it as a parry. It does have two significant virtues. One is if your opponent is definitely coming in high, like if your opponent is holding their sword, if your opponent's sword is already kind of above, their hand is already above shoulder height, it doesn't really matter what angle they come in, you will catch it with a head guard. The other advantage is it's really quick to get to from pretty much any extended hand position. You know, cut 1, and I'm in a head guard straight away. I cut 2, I'm in a head guard straight away. I cut 3, head guard, kind of wonky, but still pretty freaking quick. Cut 4, head guard straight away. 5, head guard straight away. 6, really simple. 7 is, yeah, probably the slowest, but still pretty quick. Like I can whip my sword back using the same shoulder roll I used for the Remiss really, really quickly. And so I find if you're doing things like throwing a cut 1, you've got your opponent's nice high position, I whip back. If you're coming in with your hand on your inside or your hand on the opposite side to where you're going, the opposite side where it's going to end up, you want to do a small circle with your tip. So you see from here, so get a bit lower, so you can see there's more room. A small circle with my tip to make sure that I don't pull my opponent's sword into my own head. But otherwise, yeah, it is really, really quick. So let's practice that. Let's practice from cut number 1. So, medium guard, cut 1, small circle head guard, and then straight back down with number 7. I'm getting control of my opponent's sword and coming straight back down the same way I did previously. So, from medium guard, cut number 1, small circle to the head guard, and straight back down to cut number 7. From medium guard, cut 1, head guard, number 7, back to guard. Right. Now let's try and do that as a continuous smooth motion. So I want you to really focus on just doing it as a continuous motion. If you need to slow it down, slow it down. But yeah, you basically, when you're doing this in a bout, you want it to be continuous at as high a speed as you can do it to keep forward, like just to keep pressure on your opponent. So medium guard. And again, cut, reprise, and back. And again, cut, reprise, and back. And once more for luck. Cut, reprise, and back. Right. So obviously, this one's a bit safer. I find as a taller person, this one works really, reprises work reasonably well for me because sort of thing as a standard. So their standard tactic is to come in and remiss or reprise. I don't think I've ever seen people who do redoubles as standard. And the problem with that is that it just turns into double city. And then I've also seen some quite significant arguments about who was in the wrong and caused the double when, well, if both people got hit, both people got hit. So, yeah, you're better off learning to deal with these sorts of things. In terms of how you deal with reprises or reprises, one thing is to slip and recover. So if you've parried and your opponent is getting control of your sword, just slip and recover. Abandon the cut, slip to recover that, slip to parry the second cut. And the other thing you want to do is bring your hand back to center. So if you imagine in terms of height, there's sort of your shoulder height and probably about the height of your belly button. This is, if your hand is in this area, you're centered enough that you can get to any part of the opponent or attack to any part of your opponent's body fairly quickly. So, you know, from here, if my hand is here, I can go from the head to attacking to the thigh. I mean, you're probably not going to be able to attack below the thigh. You're not going to like knock someone in the foot or something, but you can get most of their body. If your hand is higher, so if my hand is up here, and starts, you know, just above the height of my shoulder, then getting low is more cumbersome, and especially if there's a sword in the way. So if your opponent is trying to reprise you, you want to recover, back off, and get your hand back to a guard position, to a medium guard, or get your hand below the level of your shoulder, but don't go so low that you're below the height of like your belly button. You want it, you know, nice within this zone, because then your opponent can't predict when they can reprise to, and can't, you know, and can't reliably hit you. And if they try and get control of your sword, you can just throw a different riposte and take advantage of that action, that timing. Alternatively, if you can't back off, or if you've got an opponent who's bearing on you, and there are times when I will lunge, gather, and lunge again as a way of dealing with someone who backs off, then what you want to do is jam your sword on the center line, try and get your hand down, but basically, and you want to keep blade contact so that you can then parry whatever they throw next, preferably using that to keep your hand low. So, you know, if your hand is high, they reprise, just bring your hand down, do a low, like try and drive their sword down, or just try and drive everything down so that you're back in a position. The third option is to drive down and actually come forward to clinch, and just, you know, use the fact that your opponent is so close as a way of turning a sword fight into a wrestling match. If you know how to wrestle, and if the rules of the club you're at allow it. Obviously, some clubs say basically don't wrestle, because if you don't know how to fall, it gets super dangerous super quick. But yeah, that's remisses, redoubles, or remises, redoubles and reprises, or maybe reprises. I have probably pronounced all of these wrong, and I'm sorry, but, you know, that's life. All right, well, before we finish up tonight, does anyone have any questions, anything that they need to ask? Anything that they need to know? Or any comments? Did I cover everything well enough? Does anyone have anything they want to add? Has anyone gotten these to work in a different way than how I do? Alternatively, if you are a medieval or a Renaissance fencer, and your system basically says to stay in distance, to not back off, why? Like, I'm like legitimately asking, because I find that a really interesting difference, that in 19th century fencing, the basic advice is you attack, and then you recover, usually back to your starting point, and then attack again. Or maybe not always attack again, sometimes the phrase of fencing will just end, but you don't hang around. It's very, very rare. Whereas I see a lot of people who do medieval fencing where they seem to get consistently closer or they do actually hang around. And I'm really quite curious as to what the difference is. Is it just a difference of weapons? Is hanging around a thing you can do a lot more easily with a sword and buckler or a longsword that you can't with a sabre or a broadsword or an épée? Or is it a case of a difference in theory? Anyway, hope you enjoyed the lesson. If you do have any comments or questions, chuck them down in the question or the comment area. And yeah, we'll be back next week. Next week we are looking at actually doing more talk. So we're going to talk about the differences between HEMA and Japanese swordsmanship. I've got my friend Matt come along and have a bit of a chat, which should be really, really fun. Also, after this lesson, we are going to be meeting up on Zoom, and I'm going to post the address in the comments or in the chat, depending on which platform you're looking on. So I've got some comments. So Nick loved it. I'm glad you enjoyed it, Nick. That's excellent. Yeah. So we'll see if we now. Unfortunately, sadly, Nick and I are both going to have to wait for a while before we can bat each other and actually try and get this stuff to work. But we'll do when we can. So Rika, I'm really sorry for mispronouncing your name. If you're offended, you're more than welcome to come to Australia, or I'll try and come wherever you are, and we can duel to resolve the matter. Or alternatively, if it doesn't bother you, just come fence, because fencing is fun. But you're more than welcome. I really enjoy doing these lessons, so I'm glad you guys enjoy me doing them. One thing I will ask, if you do want to return the favour, is we do have some running costs for these live streams, and also increasingly we're going to have some costs with restarting, which I thought was going to be this year, and then we had a massive COVID outbreak in New South Wales where I live that's just not being handled very well. So yeah, but we are going to start back. We are going to start physical classes soon. Although at this point it's looking more and more like I'll be able to continue the live streams after. But if you can, if you do want to support more live streams or just the club in general or me, please donate as much as or as little as you like. And yeah, it'll every little bit helps. Right. Cool. So other than that, we'll be jumping on Zoom soon. I'm gonna try launching the meeting, so the details that should be in the event or in the chat. And yeah, I will see you all